The scream was almost deafening, a cry for help that echoed across the command center. It wasn't just a plea, it was a warning. The transmission cut off abruptly, followed by static, and then silence. Commander Michael Hayes, 45, white, graying hair, rugged features, sat frozen in his chair, staring at the dead screen, every muscle tensed in disbelief. The stars outside were too calm, too distant, and the hum of the spacecraft filled the air, drowning the room in an eerie stillness. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the walls. No one spoke, though every crew member could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them like the vacuum of space itself. They had all been trained for the worst. But this was different. Hayes swallowed hard, his throat tight, and he turned his gaze toward the comms panel, waiting for something, anything, to break the unbearable quiet. Then the comms flickered back to life, a voice crackling through. But it wasn't the voice they expected. "Commander, it's too late," came the cold, mechanical response, clipped and detached. The reality of the situation began to sink in. Something had gone terribly wrong, and they were now trapped in the abyss. The silence stretched on, unbearable and thick. Hayes could feel the weight of his crew's eyes on him, but he couldn't move. He had always been the one in control, the one to make the tough calls, but now he felt powerless. "We have to stay calm," he muttered, almost to himself. "If we panic, we're done for." But the words felt empty. How could they stay calm when the very foundation of their mission had just crumbled? The comms flickered again, this time with a faint voice, but it was lost in the static. The crew shifted uneasily, their hands hovering over controls that no longer felt reliable. The empty void of space outside the window seemed to echo their collective uncertainty. A low rumble echoed from somewhere deep within the ship, a quiet reminder that they weren't alone, that the ship itself, the vessel they had trusted, was now a potential threat. Hayes turned to look at the others, his gaze lingering on each one. "We're not giving up," he said with more conviction than he felt. "We still have a job to do." But deep down, Hayes wasn't sure if it was the job or the crew that would make it through this. The tension in the command center had become unbearable. Jenny Liu, 30, Asian descent, short hair, focused expression, stood at the observation window, her fingers pressed against the cool glass, staring out into the endless black. "Something's not right," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul Jenkins, 32, white, nervous, tall, approached her cautiously. "You don't think—" His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. He didn't need to say the words. They all knew what he meant. The ship was off course, or worse. Something had compromised the mission from the start. "Maybe we're not alone," Jenny replied, her voice calm but tinged with fear. It was an unsettling thought, one that made the silence even heavier. Hayes turned from the control panel and walked toward the crew, each step slow, deliberate. "We're in this together," he said, though he wasn't sure whether he was convincing them or himself. As the minutes dragged on, the air in the command center felt thick with the unsaid. Every crew member was aware of it, though none spoke it aloud. The looming presence of something beyond the stars, beyond their control. The hum of the spacecraft grew louder, more pronounced, as if responding to the rising tension within the ship. The crew members worked in silence, the only sounds being the occasional tap of fingers on consoles, or the soft whir of the machinery. But then a small, almost imperceptible sound came from the back of the room. It was a soft thud, followed by a muffled gasp. Dr. Elena Reyes, 38, Latina, composed but with a sharp edge, looked over at the noise. It was Paul, clutching his stomach, pale and sweaty. "I don't feel right," he whispered, his voice strained. Hayes moved quickly to his side, helping him to a chair. "You're going to be fine," Hayes said, though his voice faltered. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the ship. The crew was beginning to crack under the pressure. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was filled with questions. What had just happened? Was it the stress of the mission, or something more insidious? Dr. Reyes turned toward the console, her eyes scanning the data rapidly. "I've never seen anything like this," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Hayes took a step forward. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low, tight. Dr. Reyes didn't look up as she spoke, her fingers moving over the console with precision. "The ship systems, they're behaving erratically. It's like someone is overriding the controls." The revelation hit like a blow. A betrayal, or worse. Hayes turned, looking at the faces of the crew. His gaze lingered on each one, trying to read them. The fear in their eyes was becoming palpable, and Hayes knew that they were teetering on the edge of something far worse than they could handle. The reality of the mission was beginning to sink in. Commander Michael Hayes sat alone in the darkened command center, his gaze fixed on the distant stars. The silence was deafening, and every moment felt like an eternity. "I thought I could escape it," Hayes muttered, his voice hoarse, the words barely above a whisper. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but to the memory of a promise he made years ago. A promise to leave the past behind and move forward. But the past had a way of catching up. His wife, his daughter, their faces haunted him, even in the vastness of space. The weight of his guilt was suffocating, and he couldn't outrun it. He gripped the edge of the table, the cold metal grounding him in the present, but his mind wandered back to Earth, to the life he had left behind. "I thought this mission would save me, but it's only deepening the hole inside me." Hayes stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. He walked to the viewport, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. Jenny Liu was at the opposite console, her face a mask of concentration, though her eyes occasionally flickered to Hayes. He could feel the weight of her gaze, but he didn't turn to acknowledge it. "What do you see out there?" she asked, her voice soft, almost a whisper, but full of curiosity. Hayes paused, staring out into the vastness of space. The stars were beautiful, but they felt cold, indifferent. "I see nothing," he replied, his voice hollow. "A void that will swallow us all if we're not careful." Jenny stepped closer, sensing the heaviness in his tone. "We're in this together, Commander. We'll get through it." Hayes didn't respond immediately. He couldn't, not when the weight of his past and the uncertainty of the mission pressed down on him like the gravity of a dying star. A soft beep interrupted the silence. Paul Jenkins was at his station, scanning through the data. His brow furrowed in concentration as he typed quickly, but the unease in his posture didn't go unnoticed. "Something's wrong," he muttered, though his voice was shaky. "The systems aren't responding properly. The data, it's corrupted." Hayes walked over, his steps slow, the exhaustion evident in his every movement. He leaned over Paul's shoulder, peering at the screen. The data was garbled, inconsistent, a signal that something had gone terribly wrong. "Is it the system, or is someone manipulating it?" Hayes asked, his voice low, yet steady. Paul hesitated, his hands trembling as he typed in another command. "I don't know, Commander," he whispered, the fear creeping into his voice. "But whatever it is, it's not good." The sense of urgency grew as Hayes paced across the command center, the hum of the ship's systems echoing in the background. "We can't wait any longer," he said, his voice firm, but laced with frustration. "We need to fix this now." Jenny stood up from her console and walked toward him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of reassurance. "Commander, what are we dealing with? Is it sabotage?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that lay beneath it. Hayes paused, his eyes narrowing as he considered the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if it is, then we've been set up." The crew looked at each other, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. The uncertainty of their situation had become unbearable. They were no longer just facing a malfunction. They were facing something far darker, something they couldn't yet comprehend. The crew had come to a consensus. They needed to act fast. The mission was falling apart at the seams, and every passing second brought them closer to a breaking point. But in the midst of the chaos, one thing was certain. They had to stick together. "We're in this together," Hayes said, his voice now more resolute than ever. "If we fall apart, we don't make it out of here. Not alive anyway." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jenny stepped forward, her posture confident, but her eyes betrayed her fear. "We can fix this," she said. "We have to." The others nodded, though none of them were sure exactly what they were going to face. But the reality of their situation had been made painfully clear. There was no turning back now. The tension in the command center had reached its peak. Hayes paced back and forth, his mind racing through every possibility. "We can't ignore this anymore," he said, his voice tight with frustration. Jenny Liu sat at the console, her fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. "The systems are failing faster than we can fix them," she replied, her tone edged with concern. Paul Jenkins, 32, white, nervous, tall, stood at a corner of the room, his back against the wall. His anxiety was palpable. "We're running out of time, Commander. Something's happening, and I don't think it's just technical." The words hung in the air like a warning, and Hayes paused, turning slowly to face the crew. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low, a mix of disbelief and fear. "I don't know," Paul answered, swallowing hard. "But whatever it is, it's not just malfunctioning equipment. It feels like someone is tampering with us." The crew fell silent, the implications sinking in. The walls were closing in, and trust was starting to crack. Hayes turned to the team, his voice low but firm. "We need to figure out who, or what, is behind this. We can't afford to wait any longer." Jenny nodded, her fingers flying across the console, her face illuminated by the flickering screens. "I'm tracing the interference," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. The static and glitches on her screen were unlike anything she had encountered before. "But it's not just affecting the systems. It's affecting us. All of us." Hayes stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "How?" he asked, his voice cold, yet laced with concern. "I don't know," Jenny replied. "But whatever this is, it's manipulating our thoughts, our perceptions. We're all on edge, like something's pushing us toward something bad." The weight of her words settled heavily over the crew, but there was no time to process it. The ship was spiraling into chaos, and they were racing against time to figure out who, or what, was pulling the strings. The feeling of paranoia crept into the command center, settling over the crew like a thick fog. Dr. Elena Reyes was sitting at a secondary control panel, her fingers tracing over the buttons with a precise yet nervous motion. "This isn't just about a malfunction anymore," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betrayed her growing unease. "We're being controlled. This ship, it's a weapon." The room fell silent at her words. "A weapon?" Hayes asked, his voice strained. "By whom?" Dr. Reyes didn't look up as she continued, her fingers still dancing across the control panel. "I don't know, but everything is too synchronized. The glitches, the system failures. It's all intentional." Jenny looked at Dr. Reyes, her eyes wide. "You think someone's using the ship as a weapon against us?" Dr. Reyes turned her gaze to Jenny, her eyes cold and resolute. "Yes," she replied, the certainty in her voice chilling. "And it's working." Hayes felt the walls of the ship closing in around him. "This is insane," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "We can't trust anything anymore. How do we even begin to fight this?" Paul Jenkins looked up from his seat, his face pale. "We don't," he said, his voice low. "I don't think we can fight it. We just have to survive long enough to figure out what's really going on." Hayes looked at him, his eyes filled with frustration. "Survive?" he asked. "Survive what?" Paul didn't respond immediately. He just stared at Hayes, the same fear reflected in his eyes. "I don't know," Paul finally said. "But whatever happens next, it's going to change everything." The room fell into a heavy silence, the crew unsure whether the greatest threat was the malfunctioning systems, the ship itself, or something far worse, lurking in the darkness. The feeling of impending doom intensified with every passing moment. Jenny Liu stared at the data on the screen, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "This doesn't make sense," she said, her voice almost frantic. "The interference is coming from inside the ship." Hayes walked over to her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean? The systems are failing, yes. But how is that possible?" Jenny shook her head, disbelief etched on her face. It's not a failure. It's a controlled sabotage. She turned to him, her voice trembling. We're not just fighting malfunctioning systems. We're fighting a force inside this ship. The room grew even colder. Hayes looked around at the crew, his expression grim. We need to figure out who's doing this, and fast. The crew was running out of time, and trust was slipping away with every passing second. The crew gathered in the dimly lit command center, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. We're being manipulated, Commander Hayes said, his voice steady but his hands shaking. He turned to Dr. Elena Reyes with a questioning look. What are you saying? Hayes asked, his voice low but urgent. Dr. Reyes was quiet for a moment, her eyes scanning the data once more. The mission wasn't meant for success, Commander. We were set up from the start. Hayes stepped back, the weight of her words hitting him hard. The crew exchanged uncertain glances. What do you mean? Jenny Liu asked, her voice trembling. Who set us up? Dr. Reyes met Hayes' gaze, her face hardened by the truth. The agency. This mission. It's all a test, a way to see how far we'll go before we break. The revelation was like a punch to the gut. The room fell silent, every member of the crew reeling from the betrayal. Hayes was furious. He stormed over to the comms panel, slamming his fist onto the console. They lied to us, he spat, his voice rising. Everything we've been told, every single decision we made, was manipulated. The crew looked at him, their faces a mix of anger and confusion. How could they? Paul Jenkins asked, his voice shaky. They promised us that this was a genuine mission. Dr. Reyes stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. This isn't just a mission, Paul. It's an experiment. A way for them to see how we react under pressure. How much we can take before we snap. The reality of her words hit like a wave. The crew was no longer just fighting a malfunctioning system. They were fighting a higher power that had never been fully revealed. The shock of the revelation left the crew reeling. Jenny Liu sat at the console, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she tried to make sense of the data. If this was all planned, she said softly, then what happens now? What are we supposed to do? Dr. Reyes stood nearby, her face grim. We have no choice but to finish what we started. The agency won't stop until they have their answers. Hayes walked toward the viewport, his gaze fixed on the endless black of space. They've got us trapped, he said, his voice a low growl. But they're going to learn something about us. We don't break that easily. His words held a steely resolve, but underneath, fear and uncertainty still lingered. The weight of the mission felt heavier than ever. We're running out of time, Paul Jenkins said, his voice tight. We need to figure out how to stop them before they stop us. Hayes turned toward him, his face hard. We don't have time for plans right now. We just need to survive. Jenny Liu spoke up, her voice shaking but resolute. We survive by fighting back. We can't just sit here and wait to be controlled. Dr. Reyes nodded, in agreement. We need to take action. If we wait any longer, it'll be too late. The crew's resolve hardened in that moment. They weren't going to let the agency control them. They were going to fight, even if it meant risking everything. The final decision was made. We can't undo the past, Hayes said, his voice low but firm. But we can make sure they don't win. The crew stood together, the weight of the mission bearing down on them, but there was a fire in their eyes. We fight back, not just for ourselves, but for every soul who's ever been sent into space. Hayes continued. This isn't just about survival. It's about proving that we won't be controlled. The crew nodded in agreement, their resolve stronger than ever. The battle wasn't just against the systems. It was against the very forces that had tried to use them as pawns. And they were ready to fight to the end. The tension was palpable as the crew gathered around the main control panel, their faces lit by the flickering lights of malfunctioning monitors. This is it, Commander Hayes said, his voice low but determined. This is the moment we stop them. Jenny Liu stood at the console, her eyes focused, her hands moving swiftly across the controls. We're still in control of some systems, she said, her voice steady despite the mounting pressure. Paul Jenkins, 32, white, tall, nervous, stood by, his posture rigid with anxiety. "But not for long," he said, his voice tinged with fear. Hayes turned to face them all. "We've got one shot at this. If we don't take it, we're done for." He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "We fight until the end, no more running." The crew nodded in unison, their faces hardening with resolve. The battle was on. As Hayes looked around at the crew, he could see the fear in their eyes, but also something else: resolve. "We've been through worse," he said, his voice steady, but tinged with a quiet desperation. "We can't let them win, not now." Jenny Liu met his gaze, her expression resolute. "We'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice unwavering. Dr. Elena Reyes nodded. "We've come this far, we're not turning back." The ship shuddered beneath them, a reminder of the forces they were up against. But they weren't afraid anymore. Together, they were stronger than any threat the agency or the ship could throw at them. "We fight. We survive," Hayes said firmly. "Now, let's finish this." The ship shook violently as they made their final push to regain control. "We're close," Jenny Liu said, her voice tight with concentration. "I can override the last security lockout, but we need to be quick." Paul Jenkins looked over her shoulder, his eyes wide. "Are you sure? We're running out of time." Hayes stood behind them, his gaze fixed on the viewport where a vast cosmic anomaly loomed. "Do it, Jenny. We don't have another choice." Jenny nodded, her fingers flying across the console. "Almost there," she muttered, sweat beading on her forehead. The seconds felt like hours as the crew waited, every muscle tensed, every breath held. Finally, the screen flashed green. "It's done," Jenny said, her voice barely a whisper of relief. "We've regained control." But the victory felt fleeting as the ship shuddered again, warning them that the real battle had just begun. The ship's systems were back online, but the crew knew the real challenge was still ahead. "We've stopped the immediate threat," Hayes said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "But we still don't know who's behind this. We need answers." Dr. Elena Reyes walked over to the console, her face focused. "We'll find them, together." The ship shook once more, the force throwing them off balance. "Not much time," Paul Jenkins said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship. Hayes turned toward him, his face hard. "We fight now, or we die waiting for answers. You know what to do." The crew stood in silence, a moment of mutual understanding passing between them. They had come too far to fail now. And the crew stood ready, each one fully aware of the gravity of the situation. "This ends now," Hayes said, his voice stronger than before. "We fought for our lives, for our survival, and now we finish this." Jenny Liu stepped forward, her expression firm. "Let's do this," she said, her voice steady. "We won't let them control us anymore." Dr. Elena Reyes nodded. "Together, we're stronger than anything they can throw at us." The air was thick with resolve, and for the first time in a long while, the crew felt truly united. They knew what they had to do. "We fight," Hayes said, his gaze unwavering. "And we win." The silence that followed their final confrontation was deafening. The ship was still. Commander Hayes sat at the command center, his eyes fixed on the blank screens. "We did it," he murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. Jenny Liu stood by the viewport, gazing out at the vast emptiness of space. "Did we, though?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with doubt. The relief of regaining control was bittersweet. "We stopped the agency," Hayes replied, but the words felt hollow. "But at what cost?" The room was filled with unspoken questions. Paul Jenkins, 32, white, tall, nervous, stood beside them, his face grim. "We've lost too much," he said, his voice heavy. "And we might never know the full truth." The crew remained silent, their eyes drawn to the infinite blackness outside, a constant reminder of the isolation they had endured, and the questions that still lingered in the void. The hum of the ship's systems was the only sound in the command center. It had been hours since the battle was over, and yet the crew felt the weight of their survival pressing down on them. Dr. Elena Reyes sat at a secondary console, scanning the final logs. "The agency's files are gone," she said quietly, her voice tinged with frustration. "They covered their tracks well. We'll never know everything." Hayes walked over, looking over her shoulder at the screen. "At least we stopped them from using us as pawns," he said, but the satisfaction was fleeting. Jenny Liu, 30, Asian descent, short black hair, stepped forward, her gaze steady. "But the mission wasn't a failure. We found our own way. We chose to fight back." Her words rang true, but the truth of their struggle still haunted them. "And we paid the price," Paul Jenkins added, his voice quiet but full of weight. "But we survived." As the days passed, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The crew was stranded, the mission's true purpose never fully understood. Aisher, rugged, sat in the mess hall, staring out at the stars. "We'll never know the whole truth, will we?" he asked, his voice low. Jenny sat across from him, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said quietly. "But we know enough. We fought for our freedom, for our lives. That's enough." The words resonated with the crew, though the emptiness of space seemed to mock them. Dr. Elena Reyes entered, her face tired but resolute. "We don't have to know everything," she said. "We just have to survive, and we've done that." The room was still, but the weight of the journey settled into the crew's hearts. They had survived, but at a cost they might never fully understand. The crew gathered once more, facing each other with a new understanding. "We didn't just survive," Hayes said, his voice steady and clear. "We fought back. We fought for something bigger than the mission. We fought for each other." Jenny Liu nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "We may never go home, but we've made a choice. We're not just pawns anymore." Paul Jenkins stood beside her, his face filled with quiet pride. "We have our freedom, and that's something no one can take from us." Dr. Elena Reyes, 38, Latina, sharp features, looked at them all, her expression firm. "We've learned something here. We've learned that even in the darkest place we still have the power to choose." The words hung in the air, a bittersweet triumph in the face of their uncertain future. As the days turned into weeks, the crew continued their journey, no longer bound by the agency's manipulations. "We'll find a way home," Hayes said, his voice strong. "But it's not just about getting back. It's about making sure that no one else is sent out like we were." The crew stood together, facing the unknown ahead. "We didn't choose this," said, "but we can choose what we do next." Paul Jenkins smiled slightly, his anxiety replaced by a new sense of purpose. "We choose to survive. We choose to fight for what's right." Dr. Elena Reyes nodded, "And we'll keep fighting, no matter what it takes." Together, they stared out into the darkness, the stars ahead now symbols of possibility instead of emptiness. Whatever came next, they were ready. The crew stood silently, each one facing the emptiness of space. Commander Michael Hayes stood at the forefront, his back to the crew, gazing out at the distant stars. "It's over," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "But it's not the end. We've made it this far, but we still don't know what's out there." Jenny Liu stepped forward, her eyes focused on the stars ahead. "We've been through the worst," she said, her voice steady, "and we're still standing." The crew was silent, their faces marked by fatigue and uncertainty, but there was something else in their eyes, the recognition that they had fought for their survival. "No one can control us now," Hayes added. "We are free." But the stars outside remained distant, indifferent, a reminder that while their battle had ended, their journey was far from over. As the silence stretched on, Paul Jenkins looked over at Dr. Elena Reyes. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost uncertain. She turned to him, her expression hard, but her voice calm. "We keep going," she said. "We make our own path. The agency may have tried to control us, but now we control our fate." Jenny Liu nodded, her face filled with determination. "We may not have answers, but we've got our lives. And we've got each other." Hayes turned back toward the crew, his gaze steady. "We might never go home," he said, "but we can make this journey count. We choose how we live, how we fight." The room fell into a quiet moment of reflection, but the resolve in their eyes spoke louder than any words could. Jenny Lu walked slowly toward the central console, her fingers grazing the surface of the control panel. "We may be the last of our kind out here," she said, her voice filled with quiet reverence. "But we can still make a difference." The weight of her words settled in the room, and for a moment, no one spoke. Hayes approached her, his eyes softening. "We don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice steady, "but we know what we've survived. That's more than most will ever know." The ship's hum continued in the background, a constant reminder of their isolation, but it felt different now. It felt like freedom, the freedom to choose, to fight, and to survive. The crew gathered in the command center once more, the weight of their journey heavy in the air. "We've come this far," Hayes said, his voice low but full of pride. "We've faced things that would break most people, but we're still standing." Jenny Lias stepped forward, her voice steady. "This is our new beginning," she said, her eyes bright with resolve. "We make our own way from here on out." Paul Jenkins nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "No matter where we go, we're a team, and that means everything." The crew stood together, united in their strength, ready to face whatever came next. The future was unknown, but they were no longer afraid. The crew turned to the viewport once more, staring out into the endless black of space. "We don't know if we'll ever make it home," Hayes said, his voice steady but filled with a hint of finality. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." The stars outside were cold and distant, but they no longer seemed as daunting. The crew had learned to survive, and now they were ready to forge their own path. Jenny Liu stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on the console. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We choose our own destiny now." The crew stood together, united in their resolve, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The transmission cut off, and the last words echoed in the stillness of space. "Together, we survive."